Frank Sinatra walked onto the stage and grabbed the microphone in Dean's hand. Dean didn't let go, and the two men froze in front of 800 people with both hands locked on the same mic while the orchestra kept playing the last verse of Blue Moon. Wait, because what Dean whispered to Frank in that moment, 3 words nobody in the audience could hear, revealed something that had been building for months and guaranteed the Rat Pack would never be quite the same again. The Sands Hotel showroom on that Friday night in February 1965 was packed wall-to-wall with high rollers, movie stars, and civilians who'd paid double the usual cover just to see Dean Martin perform. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and expensive perfume. White tablecloths stretched across 800 seats, arranged in tight semicircles around a stage lit so bright you couldn't see past the 3rd row if you were standing under the spots. Dean was 47 minutes into his set, loose and easy the way he always was when he had a crowd eating out of his hand. He'd just finished a joke about his ex-wife's alimony lawyer when he slid into Blue Moon, and the room settled into that particular kind of quiet you only get when people are actually listening. Dean's voice floated over the brass section, smooth as aged whiskey, and he had his eyes half closed the way he did when he was really feeling a song. The microphone was an old RCA 77DX, heavy chrome with that distinctive grill, and he held it like he was born with it in his hand. He was wearing a midnight black tuxedo with peak lapels and a slim bow tie, and under the stage lights his hair looked darker than it was. The second verse was just starting, when movement caught his peripheral vision. Someone walking from the wings onto the stage, and Dean's eyes opened because nobody was supposed to be joining him for this number. Frank Sinatra stepped into the light wearing a navy tuxedo and a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. The crowd erupted. Applause crashed through the showroom like a wave hitting rocks, and people were half standing, craning to see both legends on stage together. Dean kept singing, didn't miss a note, but something flickered across his face for just a second before he smoothed it back into that easy Dean Martin smile everyone knew. Frank crossed the stage with his hands in his pockets, playing to the audience, soaking up the noise, and he came to a stop right next to Dean, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. The applause died down. The orchestra kept the arrangement going, strings carrying the melody while Dean moved into the bridge. Frank stood there, swaying slightly to the music, and then he reached for the microphone. Not tentatively, not as a joke. He reached for it the way you reach for something that's yours, and his hand closed around the chrome body right below Dean's grip. Dean didn't let go. For a second, maybe 2, nothing happened. Frank's hand was on the mic. Dean's hand was on the mic. Dean kept singing, his voice steady, and Frank's smile got tighter around the edges. Then Frank pulled just a little, testing. Dean's grip didn't shift. The orchestra was still playing. The audience was starting to notice that something was off, a ripple of confusion spreading through the room as conversation dropped to whispers. Dean finished the line he was singing, "Blue Moon, you saw me standing alone," and then he stopped. The orchestra kept going for 2 more measures before the conductor's baton froze mid-air and the music collapsed into silence. 800 people held their breath. Dean and Frank stood there with the same microphone between them, neither one letting go, neither one backing down. Dean's face was completely neutral, that performer's mask he could slide into place like a second skin, but if you looked at his eyes you could see something cold and final settling in. Frank's jaw was tight, and a flush was creeping up from his collar, turning his neck red under the stage lights. Notice something here, because this is where the night pivoted on a single choice neither man could take back. Dean leaned in, just slightly, closing the space between them until his mouth was inches from Frank's ear. The microphone was still locked between their hands, and Dean said 3 words. Nobody in the audience heard them. The guys in the orchestra couldn't make them out. But Frank heard them, and his whole face changed. The color that had been rising drained away in less than a second, leaving him pale under the spots. His grip on the microphone went slack. Dean straightened up. He looked out at the audience with that same easy smile, like nothing at all had just happened, and he said into the mic, "Folks, let's hear it for Frank Sinatra." And he started clapping with one hand while still holding the microphone with the other. The crowd erupted again, confusion turning into applause because that's what you do when Dean Martin tells you to clap. Frank stood there for another beat, 2 beats, his hand hovering near the mic like he wasn't sure what to do with it, and then he turned and walked off the stage. The audience was still applauding. Dean let it ride for a few seconds, then he raised his free hand, and the applause died down. "Frank's got to save himself for the late show," Dean said, and there was a scatter of laughter, nervous but real. He turned to the conductor, gave him a nod, and said, "From the top, maestro." The orchestra swung back into Blue Moon like the last 60 seconds had been erased from existence, and Dean picked up the song exactly where he'd left off. His voice as smooth and unshaken as if he'd just been standing there alone the whole time, but his left hand, the one not holding the microphone, was trembling, just barely, just enough that if you were standing in the wings, you'd see his fingers twitching against his thigh. He finished the song. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. He's up, segued straight into "Ain't That a Kick in the Head?" without a pause, keeping the energy high, keeping everyone's attention on the performance and away from what they'd just witnessed but didn't understand. Backstage, in the narrow hallway between the stage door and the dressing rooms, Frank was standing with his back against the wall and his hands in his pockets. He wasn't moving. 2 stagehands walked past and gave him a wide berth, eyes down, not saying a word. The stage manager, a guy named Eddie who'd worked the Sands for 12 years and seen every kind of showroom drama there was, stopped in front of Frank and asked if he needed anything. Frank looked at him like he was a piece of furniture and didn't answer. Eddie kept walking. "Listen, because what happened in that hallway matters as much as what happened on stage." Frank stayed there for the rest of Dean's set, 42 minutes, not moving except to light a cigarette and then let it burn down to the filter without smoking it. Every time Dean hit a punchline and the crowd roared, Frank's jaw would tighten. Every time Dean's voice floated through the stage door, clear and controlled and completely unaffected, Frank's hands would curl into fists inside his pockets. When Dean finally took his bow and the curtain came down, Frank was gone. Nobody saw him leave, he just wasn't there anymore. Dean came off stage, and the first thing he did was ask for a towel. His shirt was soaked through under the tuxedo jacket, dark patches spreading across his back and under his arms. His hands were still shaking, harder now that nobody could see them except Eddie and the wardrobe girl who brought him the towel. He wiped his face, rubbed the back of his neck, and then he asked where Frank was. Eddie said he didn't know. Dean nodded like he'd expected that answer, and he walked to his dressing room without saying another word. Stop for a second and understand what you're really looking at. Dean Martin had spent 10 years building the Rat Pack into the most famous entertainment machine in Vegas. 10 years of letting Frank run the show, make the calls, decide who was in and who was out. 10 years of being the easygoing sidekick who showed up on time, hit his marks, got the laughs, and never complained when Frank changed the set list 5 minutes before curtain or invited 20 people to after parties Dean wasn't told about until they were already happening. Dean had played the role so long and so well that people forgot it was a role. They thought that was just who he was, laid back, unflappable, content to let Frank be the sun and orbit around him like a planet. But here's what people didn't know. 3 weeks before that night at the Sands, Dean had been in his dressing room after a show when Frank walked in without knocking and told him he was cutting Dean's solo segment from 25 minutes to 15 because they needed time for a new comedy bit Frank wanted to try. Dean had said, "Sure, no problem." He'd smiled. He'd made a joke about having more time to hit the bar. And then after Frank left, Dean sat in front of his mirror for 20 minutes, staring at his own reflection, and didn't move. The wardrobe girl who was gathering costumes said later she thought he'd fallen asleep with his eyes open. He hadn't. He was making a decision. The decision was this. The next time Frank tried to take something from him in front of an audience, Dean wasn't going to smile and let it happen. He wasn't going to play along. He was going to hold his ground, and if it cost him the Rat Pack, if it cost him the easiest paycheck in Vegas, if it cost him the friendship everyone assumed was unbreakable, then that's what it would cost. Because Dean had realized something that night in front of the mirror, something that had been creeping up on him for months but he'd been pushing down. He was tired of being the supporting act in his own career. When Frank grabbed that microphone 3 weeks later, Dean knew immediately what it was. It was the same move Frank had pulled a dozen times before, in a dozen different ways. It was Frank reminding everyone on stage and off that he was the one in charge, that the spotlight was his to give and take away, that Dean's whole career existed because Frank allowed it to. And Dean looked at Frank's hand on that chrome microphone and thought, not this time. The 3 words he whispered weren't clever. They weren't a threat. They were just true. "I'm done, Frank." That's what he said. 3 words, 4 syllables. And Frank understood immediately what Dean meant, because Frank was a lot of things, but he wasn't stupid. Dean wasn't talking about the song. He wasn't talking about the bit. He was talking about the whole arrangement, the entire decade-long dance of Dean playing second fiddle so Frank could feel like the king of Vegas. Dean was done. And Frank knew that if he didn't let go of that microphone and walk off that stage, if he pushed it even 1 inch further, Dean was going to say something into that mic that would blow the whole illusion apart in front of 800 witnesses. So Frank let go, and he walked off, and Dean kept singing. In Dean's dressing room after the show, he sat in the leather chair in front of the mirror and loosened his bow tie. His hands had finally stopped shaking. There was a knock on the door. Dean didn't answer. The knock came again, harder this time. "It's open," Dean said. The door swung inward, and Sammy Davis Jr. stood there in a burgundy suit with a thin tie, his face tight with worry. "What the hell just happened out there?" Sammy asked. Dean looked at him in the mirror. "Frank and I had a disagreement about the set list." "That's not what it looked like." "That's what it was." Sammy came into the room and closed the door behind him. He perched on the arm of the couch and watched Dean's reflection in the mirror. "Frank's not going to let this go," Sammy said quietly. "You know that, right?" Dean pulled off his bow tie and dropped it on the counter. "I know." "So what happens now?" "Now I do my shows, I honor my contract, and when it's up, I renegotiate without the Rat Pack clause." Sammy's eyes widened. "You're serious?" "As a heart attack." "Dean, this is—" Sammy stopped, shook his head, started again. "This is everything. The 5 of us, the Rat Pack. It's the best thing any of us have ever had." Dean turned in his chair to face Sammy directly, not through the mirror. "Sammy, answer me this. When was the last time you did something on stage that Frank didn't approve first?" Sammy opened his mouth, closed it, thought about it. "I don't know what you mean." "Yeah, you do." The silence stretched out. Somewhere down the hall someone was laughing, the sound muffled through walls and closed doors. Sammy looked at his hands. "It's not like that," he said finally. "It's exactly like that. And I'm not blaming Frank. He built this thing. He put us all on the map. But somewhere along the way I forgot I had a map of my own." Dean stood up and started unbuttoning his shirt. "I'm not trying to blow anything up. I'm just saying the next contract I sign, it's gonna be for me, not for us." Sammy nodded slowly, like he was processing something he'd known but never let himself think about. "You told him that? Out there?" "More or less." "What'd you say exactly?" Dean pulled off his shirt and reached for a hanger. "That's between me and Frank." Sammy stood up. "He's gonna try to freeze you out. You know that. He's got enough pull to make sure you don't work in this town." "Then I'll work somewhere else." "Dean." "Sammy." Dean's voice was quiet but firm. "I love you. I love Frank. I love this whole circus. But I've been playing a part for 10 years and I forgot it was a part. Tonight I remembered, that's all." Sammy looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once and left. Dean finished changing into street clothes, gray slacks and a black polo shirt, and he sat back down in front of the mirror. His reflection looked older than it had 2 hours ago. Tired, but his hands were steady. Remember this because it's the moment everything afterward stems from. Dean didn't walk out of the sands that night angry or scared or triumphant. He walked out knowing he'd just changed the fundamental terms of his professional life and couldn't take it back even if he wanted to. Frank would never trust him the same way again. The Rat Pack would continue, would do shows and albums and movies, but the easy camaraderie would have a crack running through it now, invisible to the audience, but always there, always felt. Dean had traded comfort for honesty, and he'd done it in the most public way possible short of taking out a billboard. The Sands security guard at the backstage exit, a guy named Tommy who'd worked there since the hotel opened, watched Dean walk past and said, "Hell of a show tonight, Mr. Martin." Dean stopped, turned, looked at Tommy. with genuine curiosity. "You liked it?" "Best one I've seen in 6 months." "Why's that?" Tommy grinned. "You looked like you meant it." Dean smiled, a real one this time, and walked out into the Las Vegas night. The air was cold for February, dry and sharp, and the neon from the strip reflected off the low clouds in bands of red and blue and gold. Dean's car was parked in the performer's lot, a silver Cadillac Eldorado with the top down even in winter. He got in, started the engine, and sat there with his hands on the wheel, not going anywhere yet. A taxi pulled up to the backstage entrance and Frank Sinatra got out. Dean watched in the rearview mirror as Frank paid the driver and walked toward the door. Frank stopped, turned, looked directly at Dean's car. For maybe 5 seconds, the two men made eye contact across 40 feet of empty parking lot. Neither one moved. Neither one waved. Then Frank turned back to the door and went inside, and Dean put the Cadillac in gear and drove out of the lot. He went home. Not to a party, not to a bar. Home to his house in the hills with the view of the city lights spread out below like a carpet of diamonds. He poured himself a drink, real liquor, not the tea he drank on stage, often, and he sat on his balcony and watched Vegas glow in the dark. His daughter called. He told her he loved her. She asked if everything was okay. He said everything was fine. He wasn't lying, it was fine. It was different, but it was fine. The next day, the Las Vegas Sun ran a review of the show. The critic, a man who'd been covering Vegas entertainment for 15 years, devoted 2 paragraphs to Dean's performance and 1 sentence to Frank's appearance. The sentence read, "Sinatra made a brief stage appearance during Martin's set but did not perform." That was it. No mention of the microphone, no mention of the silence. The 800 people who'd been in that room told the story 100 different ways over the next few weeks, and it grew in the telling the way these things always do. Some versions had Dean shoving Frank. Some had Frank walking off in tears. Some had the whole Rat Pack backstage in a fistfight. None of those things happened. What happened was smaller and quieter and more permanent. Dean had drawn a line, and Frank had seen it and chosen not to cross it, and that choice reverberated through every interaction they had afterward. They performed together dozens more times. They made movies, they joked on stage and recorded albums and showed up at each other's benefits. But the friendship everyone had seen as indestructible had a hairline fracture running through it now, and both men knew exactly where it was. 5 years later, Dean would leave the Rat Pack entirely to focus on his television show and his solo concerts. 10 years later, Frank would tell an interviewer that Dean was the most talented performer he'd ever worked with. 20 years later, when Frank was sick and his memory was starting to fade, Dean would visit him in the hospital and sit by his bed without saying much of anything, and Frank would hold his hand like they were young again, like nothing had ever come between them. But the night at the Sands in February 1965 remained between them, unspoken but always present. A reminder that even the closest partnerships have limits, and sometimes those limits are tested in front of 800 people under stage lights that make everything visible except the truth. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. And if you want to hear about the night Dean walked into Frank's dressing room 6 months later and said something that made Frank laugh for the first time since the microphone incident, tell me in the comments. Some stories don't end where you think they do.